In this video, you're going to learn how to build an API in AWS using a serverless framework. You're going to use Lambda function with the API gateway, all to be built with Terraform. I'm your host, Sam Gabriel, and let's get started. All right, so what we're going to do here is we are going to see how Lambda works with the API gateway. We're going to show a demo of how this is all going to get built using Terraform. And then we're going to spend some time going through the configuration to see how all the magic works. So let's go ahead and figure out how Lambda works with the API gateway. So you have a client, and this client wants to access your API. So we put an API gateway, and you define a method. So of course your API will have many methods. So for this demo, we're going to have a get method, and behind it you're going to have your Lambda function that's going to get triggered by the API gateway. And this function is going to have a very simple role. It's going to create a currency conversion. It's written in Python, and you basically give it an amount, let's say 100, and convert 100, let's say Canadian dollars to US dollars, or vice versa, or whatever currency you want to convert. So what happens is the client request comes in to the API gateway. The API gateway invokes the Lambda function, and we get the result back through the API gateway, and that gets passed over back to the client. And one thing to note, when I was looking through this, I was thinking in my head, how can I use Lambda for APIs when Lambda can only last for 15 minutes? And the answer is really the API gateway that is always on, ready to take requests and then invoke that Lambda function in the backend. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the demo, see how this all works. Let's go to my Visual Studio Code here, and let's see, not this one, this one over here. Okay, so we have a repo, a GitHub repo, and I have a bunch of instructions here to walk us through how this all works. I have a main.py. This is where the function code lives, and we're going to go through that in the configuration section. But for now, let's go ahead and go through these instructions and run the demo. All right, first things first, we need to create a requirements.txt file. This is to allow us to package up a zip file that we're going to upload into AWS. This is what the Lambda function needs to get created. So we're going to do that. We're going to create, actually before that, I always use pipenv to help me create a virtual environment when I'm developing with Python, right? So once I'm done developing, you end up with a pip file here, and this pip file will contain all the dependencies that you might need. Now, once I've done that, I want to run this pipenv requirements command that will push all those requirements to a text file called requirements.txt that we're going to bundle in that zip file that we need for Lambda to work. Okay, so now we have that created. Perfect. Let's move to the next section. Here I want to install all of my dependencies in a folder called package. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so now we should have inside the infrastructure folder here, we should have a folder called package, and all my dependencies are over here. All right, perfect. Now let's go into, let's change directory in here. So let's just clear that for a second. And now we're inside the package directory, and let's go ahead and zip it. So let's zip that. And now we are ready to go back into in here, and let's zip my main.py. This is where I showed you the Python function lives. And we're going to zip that as well, and that will all be packaged in this my deployment package.zip file that we're going to use with Lambda. All right, so now we need to start working with Terraform, and the first thing we need to do is export our environment variables, AWS environment variables, to get us going. And to do that, I need to have an AWS account. So if you're using the TechNAid Academy subscription, you get access to AWS accounts, and you can launch an AWS account very easily here, as you can see in the AWS environment lecture. So you can just click launch AWS environment, and that is going to find an available AWS account and give you the details to log into this account. All right, so we have all the necessary information to log into this account. Also gives you the actual environment variables that we can use with Terraform, so I can copy that. And by the way, this lasts for 3 hours, and it will self-destruct at the end of the 3 hours. This is plenty of time, of course, to play with our lab here. So copying that over, and we are going to paste this in here, and now we have this shell ready to go with initializing Terraform and running Terraform. All right, so let's go ahead and run Terraform init. So this is going to initialize Terraform and get everything ready for us. And now let's run Terraform plan to see what is going to get created. And by the way, if you do not really know Terraform very well, I have a Terraform 101 course that you can access in the TechNAid Academy and work with that. And I'll put a link to it in the description of this video where you can access it. All right, we ran Terraform plan. Let's expand this a little bit and see what happened here. You can see a bunch of resources are getting deployed: an API gateway deployment, API gateway integration with Lambda, API gateway method, the get method that we mentioned, an API gateway resource, of course, and a REST API. We have the API gateway stage that we're going to deploy, and we'll get a URL at the end of running Terraform to be able to access the function. AWS CloudWatch log group to be able to see our logs in CloudWatch, an IAM policy that is needed for Lambda, an IAM role for Lambda, and an IAM role policy attachment for Lambda, a Lambda function itself here. And this is the file name that we need for the Lambda function. This is the zip file that we just created, so we're going to push that over. And Lambda permissions as well for the API gateway to access Lambda. So these are the resources, 12 to deploy. So let's go ahead and run Terraform apply. I'll run Terraform apply here, and this should run the plan again. And if everything is good, we like it, we'll hit yes. And we'll find the endpoint at the end of this run. So it takes about 10 seconds or 15 seconds to get everything ready to go, and we'll have that URL at the end to play around with our API and make some conversions for different currencies. Okay, looks like it is complete. Endpoint URL is this one, so I can just open this in a browser window, and as you can see here, we are automatically getting a result, and the whole conversion happens in the parameters at the top here. You can see the amount is 100, and from currency from US dollars to Canadian dollars, and the result is $136.34. This all works fine. Of course, you can make changes here. You can say instead of $100, you can say $200, hit enter, and you get your result back right away, and we're hitting the API function. So that all works very well. We've deployed everything using Terraform. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the configuration, how all this magic happened. All right, so let's go back and look at the main function. So let's remove this for now. Now this is the Python code that is run with Lambda, and any Lambda function has to have this Lambda handler. Okay, And basically it's listening for events. And what happens is I can grab the parameters that we saw in the URL, the amount, the from currency, the to currency, doing this with the event query string parameters, and again catching the amount from currency to currency and saving them in these variables. And then I'm also using the logger or logging Python library to send some logs that we will see in CloudWatch shortly. So here you can see that I'm logging out the input parameters, the amount, the from currency, the to currency. I'm also running this convert currency function at the bottom here, which takes on the amount, the from currency, the to currency. And all it's doing, it's creating a class of currency rates, which is using the Forex Python library. And once you do that, again, you send that over to a convert function in this class or convert method in this class with these different parameters, and you get the result. The result gets passed back in here. We log the result out to CloudWatch, and then the Lambda function itself needs to respond with JSON. So here we respond with a status code of 200, and the body needs to also be in JSON format. So we're running json.dumps to take on the result and put it here in this JSON format. The logger finally responds back with this particular JSON response as well, so we can see it in our logs. And that is it. Very simple Python Lambda function that gets generated through the API gateway. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at our infrastructure, and particularly the main.tf file here. And as you can see, we're defining the Terraform block with the required providers is the AWS provider, pinning the version, which is always good practice. And we are going to run in US East 1. We have a bunch of resources. So let's focus on the AWS Lambda specific resources that are needed. The first one is the AWS Lambda function. And here you define a few things, such as the name of the function you want to give it. The runtime is Python 3.9. The role, there is a role here that's going to be associated with this particular function, AWS Lambda function. The handler here is very important to understand that it's a combination of the name of the file, main, which is the name of the file here, main.py. All right, so main, and then dot, and then the Lambda handler is the main function here that is handling the events, right? So main.lambda handler is what you want to define here. And then the file name that we're pushing up there, and this is the my deployment package.zip that we just created at the beginning of this video, where we're zipping the dependencies and also the main.py file and shipping it out to AWS. Depends on, these are a few things that we want this Lambda function to depend on, a few resources, the AWS IAM role policy attachment, and the AWS CloudWatch log group. Okay, we're creating a CloudWatch log group so we can see the logs from Lambda, and we're giving it this name or path here. Retention is 14 days. Then we're looking at an AWS IAM policy, and this policy is called Lambda logging in the path at the root path. And the description is that this is an IAM policy for logging from a Lambda function. So you can see here the policy, we allow creating log group, creating a log stream, and putting or updating log events. So that is what's going to allow Lambda to post logs into CloudWatch. Then we're creating this AWS IAM role policy attachment where we're taking on the AWS IAM role called Lambda role and the policy, AWS IAM policy that we just created up here. And we're creating those as an attachment. And then we have the AIM role here that we just mentioned, the Lambda role, and in here we are allowing access to the Lambda service. Okay, so we're able to do things with Lambda, of course. All right, so that kind of covers the Lambda portion of the Terraform config. Now let's take a look at the API gateway portion. Remember, the API gateway is what allows the client to hit the API gateway that talks to the Lambda in the background. All right, so we need to create a REST API with the AWS API gateway. So we do that, we call it example API. The AWS API gateway resource is what we define here. You have a REST API ID, which calls on this particular API gateway REST API resource, and also the parent ID is here as well. Path part is a variable. You can see this variable over here under variables. The endpoint path we're going to use is conversion. So if you look at the actual API call, it's under it's /dev/conversion. So really that's the endpoint that we're hitting, conversion. Okay, so that's the path that we defined here. There's also the AWS API Gateway method that we're using is get. It's a get method, so we're able to use the browser to easily get the result here, as opposed to a post method, which you might need to do a little bit more work, maybe use Postman or create some front end to make the post call. All right, so we've got the method ready. We're not doing any authorizations. Authorization is none to keep it simple. The AWS API Gateway integration is where we're integrating the API Gateway with the Lambda. So here we're again talking about the REST API ID, resource ID, the HTTP method that we just defined here, and the integration HTTP method is post. This is mandatory when you're using the type AWS proxy. So AWS proxy is the way to go. There was another method or type before, but recommendation from AWS now is to use the AWS proxy. And the URI here is the AWS Lambda function, invoke ARN, so ARN, so that's the one that was defined here as well. Okay, so that's really where the glue happens between the API Gateway and the Lambda function. Now we need some permissions to allow the API Gateway to talk to the Lambda function. So allow execution from API Gateway, action is the Lambda invoke function, and so on and so forth. Now the source ARN is very important here, and I didn't actually mention it. I should have mentioned it before we ran Terraform. I do mention it in the instructions here, and that is in the file terraform.tf-vars, you need to put your account ID. And this account ID, you'll see if you go to Terraform tf-vars, is this one here, which I had ahead of time. This account ID you get when you're running the, let's see, when you're running the AWS environment. When you've ran the AWS environment, you can find the account ID right here. It spits it out. If you are using your own AWS account or your work account, you can always see the ID at the top right corner of your AWS account, and I'll show you that in a minute when we launch the AWS console. All right, so back to our main.tf. Now we have this ARN. Everything here is fine. It's all variables that have been defined or resources that have already been defined for the source ARN. This resource, AWS API Gateway deployment, is needed to be able to finally deploy the API Gateway, REST API Gateway, so that we can access it from our browser. So you can see here the trigger redeployment. We've seen the life cycle is create before destroy. This is important because if we make an update to this endpoint, you need to be able to tell AWS to create the new deployment before destroying the old one, because the default in Terraform is to destroy first, then create. Now also the depends on is also very important to make sure that you have the API Gateway method is created before this gateway deployment is created, and also the API Gateway integration. Finally, the last resource is the API Gateway stage, and we call this stage dev. Of course, you can call it task dev, whatever you want, or prod. And this really reflects here when we look at the URL. You get dev here, and then of course the conversion is the endpoint that we were hitting. So this pretty much sums it up when it comes to the configuration from a Terraform perspective. Of course, we have our outputs here, which outputted the URL for our endpoint. I also added a parameter here to be able to show us, an example for currency conversion. The variables, we kind of looked at this really quickly. The region, the account ID, the Lambda function name, we call it currency converter, and the endpoint path. All right, so now let's go ahead and open the AWS console and take a look at what we have there. I'm going to go back to my go back to my lab environment, my AWS account environment, and copy the URL and go back to my incognito window. Let's paste that here, and I'm going to need my IAM username, which is this one, and my password, which is this one. Okay, and let's sign in. Alright, so now we have our AWS console here. And as I promised before, if you want to look at your account ID, you can click at the top right here and you'll see the account ID right here. Alright, so let's go ahead and take a look at Lambda. I want to look at CloudWatch, and I want to look at the API gateway. So let's get those loaded. First of all, let's take a look at the AWS Lambda console, and I want to show you a couple of things. The function name here is currency converter, so click on that, and you can see the trigger here for the currency converter is the API gateway, and this will load the actual function itself in this kind of like an IDE window here where you can make changes, and when you're done changes, you deploy those changes and see the difference or see what happens. You can also look at the monitoring section. This pulls up CloudWatch logs, or you can view the logs directly in CloudWatch. If we go and take a look at CloudWatch itself, you'll see that there is a logs group here that we can take a look at. This logs group got generated, of course, by Terraform, and Lambda has access to right to it. So if we go here, we can see the log stream here, the last log that we saw, and we can see the different. If I make this a bit bigger, you can see here the logs that we saw in the Python code. The input parameters, 100 is the amount from US dollars to Canadian dollars. The result is right here. The response with JSON is also available right here. So all this is showing us, of course, here's another stream where we ran the 200 US dollars and the result and so on. So all this is very useful to be able to see your logs here in CloudWatch. And finally, the API gateway is that example API that we talked about. And if I open that, you'll be able to see a nice diagram showing you, here's the get method that we talked about, and the endpoint is conversion. So at this point here, you can see the client making a request through the method request here, and that goes to a Lambda proxy that invokes the Lambda function, and then you get a response back to the client. So it's very nice to see that. You can also have a test here, so you can run a test parameters here. You can see the conversion, run test, and you can see some of the logs here as well. And I've used this quite a bit to troubleshoot until I got to a place where it's actually working. So you can see here, you can run these tests straight from the API gateway itself and see the response from Lambda. This is everything I wanted to show you in this video. I hope this has been useful. To sum up, we basically were able to run serverless and create an API using AWS's API gateway in conjunction with Lambda and build everything with Terraform. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in another video.